Okay, so diving right in, one of our listeners has presented us with, I think, a really fascinating question. Uh, could their experiences potentially align with what was once known as Asperger's,
Hmm.
now more broadly categorized as ASD, autism spectrum disorder? And they've shared with us some pieces to consider, like some personal reflections and even a scientific study.
Yeah.
So we're going to try to kind of unpack that today and see what kind of connections we can make. Obviously, this isn't a diagnosis,
Of course, of course.
but we can certainly explore these ideas.
Absolutely. And it's great that our listener is curious about these connections between their own life and what's out there in the scientific world. And I think one thing that really jumps out from the information provided is that study they sent about early childhood traumatic brain injury,
TBI.
TBI
Yeah.
exactly, and a potential link to a higher likelihood of ASD.
Yeah, and that's interesting, right? Because they talked about having carbon monoxide poisoning and then also a possible head injury when they were really little. So, I mean, that kind of falls right in line with what the study's talking about.
It does. And it's really fascinating because early childhood is such a crucial period for brain development.
Sure.
And events like TBI,
Mm,
that they can potentially influence those developmental pathways that are unfolding.
totally.
And I think the research is still ongoing
Right.
to really tease apart those specific mechanisms.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And, something else that I thought was really interesting that they mentioned was that their sister actually has autism.
Okay.
Um, but resulting from oxygen deprivation at birth. So a different cause than, the early brain trauma we were just talking about. But I think it raises an important question, right? Like about family history
Yeah.
and, potential genetic factors.
Absolutely. I mean, it brings up this whole idea of neurodiversity and possible underlying predispositions to these kinds of developmental differences.
Right.
So even though the cause for the sister's autism is different, the fact that there is neurodevelopmental variation within the family
Yeah.
is definitely something to keep in mind.
For sure, for sure. And then of course, our listener was sharing some of their own experiences and they talked about sometimes feeling socially awkward and that they relied a lot on their mother for guidance in social situations, which I think kind of, if you think about the characteristics that are sometimes associated with ASD,
Yeah.
it kind of falls in line.
It does. And navigating those social interactions, picking up on unspoken social cues.
Right.
These can be areas where individuals on the autism spectrum might describe things differently.
Right.
And I think it's, relying on their mother for support in those situations, it could, potentially reflect those kinds of challenges.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so then this is where it gets really interesting. They also brought up the concept of giftedness,
Okay.
being gifted. So is there a connection there?
Well, the research does suggest that giftedness and ASD can actually coexist. So we do see these cases where there are exceptional talents in certain areas alongside some of the characteristics that we see in autism.
Ah, interesting.
So it just adds another layer to this whole picture.
Absolutely, absolutely. And then I thought this was interesting too. So it wasn't just their own personal observations, but they were saying that they had some experiences with like government recruiters suggesting that maybe some job roles would align with traits sometimes observed in ASD,
Hmm.
and they were even added to an Asperger's WhatsApp group.
Wow.
So these are more external observations, right?
They are, yeah. And while those aren't, formal evaluations in any way, they do kind of point to the fact that other people are noticing patterns
Right.
that they associate with ASD. So I can totally see why these experiences would lead our listener to ask these questions.
Exactly, exactly. So, okay, we've covered a lot of ground. We talked about that potential link with early brain trauma, the nuances of family history, social experiences, the idea of giftedness, and these kind of external observations. But I think the real key takeaway here that we need to underscore is that,
This is exploration.
yeah,
And exploration is great, but it's not a diagnosis.
right, exactly. So, for our listener out there who is thinking about all of this and wants to get a clear understanding,
Yeah.
what would you suggest?
Honestly, the best thing to do would be to connect with a qualified healthcare professional,
Right.
someone like a clinical psychologist
Okay.
or a psychiatrist, even a developmental pediatrician,
Sure.
because they have the expertise to really delve into your history, to
Mhm.
conduct the proper assessments,
Right.
and to provide a diagnosis if it's appropriate.
Okay. So just to wrap things up, we looked at, those early brain trauma questions, the family history, the social experiences, the giftedness, and those external observation, all these different factors. And those touch on some of the key areas, that are considered when you're talking about ASD.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary.
But a professional evaluation, that's really the necessary step.
Yeah, to get a definitive answer.
Absolutely. Well, hey, this has been a really interesting deep dive.
Yeah.
So I'll leave our listener with one final thought. Regardless of whether, you decide to pursue a formal diagnosis or not, and regardless of what the outcome of any assessment might be, how could a deeper understanding of your own, neurocognitive style,
Hmm.
your strengths, your challenges, how could that contribute to greater self-awareness and maybe even help you navigate the world around you more effectively?
That's a great question.
Something to ponder.
It is, yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing your deep dive with us.
Yeah, this was great.